Assalamu alaikum, dear students. The poem that we are going to do today is Mr. Bliney by Philip Larkin. This poem belongs to the volume of poems which was entitled The Whitsun Weddings. This collection of poems appeared in 1964, though the poem itself was written in July 1955. In this poem, we are indirectly introduced to the character of Mr. Bliney. This poem is in a dramatic monologue form. We are introduced to the character of Mr. Bliney through a conversation which goes on between the landlady of the house and the new tenant. The new tenant, who is the persona of the poem as well, has come to take this room on rent, the same room which has been evacuated by Mr. Bliney. This poem, it shows us the character of Mr. Bliney, who is a representative of modern man. Mr. Bliney's life, as it appears in the poem, is a very bleak, dull, dreary, and ambitionless life. It is a life which shows lack of creativity. Through the character of Mr. Bliney, we come to know the dilemma that modern man faces. It's the dilemma which is being faced by the modern man of the 20th century, and it continues, where the modern man is engripped with the feeling of meaninglessness of life, futility of life, and lack of will and aspiration of life. Now let us read the poem. This was Mr. Bliney's room. He stayed the whole time he was at the bodies, till they moved him. Flowered curtains, thin and frayed, fall to within 5 inches of the sill, whose window shows a strip of building land tussocky littered. Mr. Bliney took my bit of garden properly in hand. As the poem opens, we see that the poem has got 7 stanzas, and each stanza has 4 lines. That is, it is of quatrain structure. The poem opens with a very conversational tone. The dialogue is taking place between the landlady of the room and the new tenant. The landlady, in a very conversational tone, which is also the hallmark of the poet Philip Larkin, because he uses a conversational tone and a very colloquial language in his poems. And in this poem also we see the same language and the same style being continued. So the landlady, she tells us that the room had been occupied by a previous tenant who was called Mr. Bliney. And this man, he continued to live in this room till he was working at the bodies. The word bodies here is very significant because, according to some critics, this was the place where Philip Larkin also spent some portion of his life. And this again shows that the poem has got an autobiographical touch. Then we are told that this man, that is Mr. Bleaney, he kept on living in this place till they moved him. And here it is quite important because he did not move out of his own will. It shows that probably when he died, he was moved out of this room. This again shows man's helplessness against death. It also shows the dilemma of the modern man where he lacks the free choice of his own. So Mr. Bleaney, who had been living in this place for so long, he had no choice but to leave the room when he died. So after this introduction has been made by the landlady, we see the persona of the poem taking a look around the room. And when he looks at the room, what he sees is flowered curtains, thin and frayed, fall to within 5 inches of the sill. So the curtains which are covering the window, they are thin and they are frayed. So that this shows that the repeated washing of the curtains has left these curtains thin, and they also have lost the color. Another important thing that we notice is that they fall within 5 inches of the sill. That means they are shorter than the window sill. This is quite symbolic here because it shows that what man aspires to be, what he dreams to be in his life, his dreams, they fall short of reality. And it also shows the life of Mr. Bleaney, who was doomed to live in this small one room which he had rented. And his life was very dull, was very static. He kept on living in this room till death forced him out of this room. So here emerges the most important theme, and which is a very favorite theme of Mr. Philip Larkin, that is the dullness, the dreariness, helplessness, and isolation of human life. Mr. Bleaney is not shown to be living with a family. He is all alone in his room. This also has an autobiographical touch because Philip Larkin spent a life of isolation. He had no wife, he had no children. He spent all his life alone. The new tenant keeps on looking at the room, making a survey of the room as we moved on to the next stanza. When he looks around the room, he sees the windows. They show a strip of building land, tussocky littered. So when he looks out of the room, of the window, he sees a strip of land where probably a building is being constructed, and it is all litter around. So when the landlady sees him peeping out of the window and having a look around, she again, in a lowering way, in a persuading way, she says, Mr. Bliney took my bit of garden properly in hand. So she, being the landlady of the house, wants this room to be occupied by the new tenant. So she says that Mr. Bliney, he had taken the bit of garden properly in hand. That is the place which can be seen out of the window, the portion of the land which, according to the new tenant, is littered. The landlady tells him that it was previously a garden which was well maintained by Mr. Bliney. Again, we see the new tenant looking around the room. And when he looks around the room, what does he see? Bed, upright chair, 60-watt bulb, no hook behind the door, no room for books or bags. So when he sees around the room, he sees that there's a bed there in the room, the chair, there is a 60-watt bulb, and there is no hook behind the door, neither a place for books or bags to keep. Now, the belongings that are there in the room, these show the situation of the room. There is just one bed, one chair, and the 60-watt bulb is very significant here because a 60-watt bulb gives out a very bleak kind of light. There is no hook behind the door, so it's not a very comfortable kind of a room. Neither is there any place for books or bags. Now, indirectly, we are being given an insight into the life of Mr. Bliney as well. What kind of life was being led by Mr. Bliney? He had such meager kind of belongings in the room. He was accustomed to living in the light of a bulb which just gave 60-watt voltage. He could easily live without a hook behind the door. He probably had no books or bags, so he did not need any cupboard or any shelf to put the books. So this establishes a contrast between the persona of the poem and Mr. Bliney. But again, there is irony here that when the persona of the poem looks around and he sees the deficiencies in the room, instead of rejecting the room, he says, I will take it. And then he goes on to say, so it happens that I lie where Mr. Bliney lay, and stub my fags on the same saucer souvenir, and try stuffing my ears with cotton wool to drown the jabbering set he egged her on to buy. So this sentence, a very brief, a very curt kind of response from the persona of the poem, I'll take it. It shows the similarity between the status of this new tenant and Mr. Bliney. If Mr. Bliney could afford this kind of room, so is the situation of the new persona. Their financial status are similar. Because then he goes on to say, so it happens that I lie where Mr. Bliney lay. He's lying on the same bed on which Mr. Bliney lay, and he is stubbing the fags on the same saucer souvenir, that is the ashtray. He's smoking cigarette, and he is stubbing the fags on the same ashtray which was previously used by Mr. Bliney, and tries stuffing my ears with cotton wool to drown the jabbering set he egged her on to buy. And he's trying to stuff, to put cotton wool in his ears so as to block the noise or coming, the jabbering noise coming out of the radio set, which Mr. Bliney had persuaded the landlady to buy for him. So here again, the persona tries to establish a difference between him and Mr. Bliney. Mr. Bliney was fond of listening to the music of the radio, so he had persuaded the landlady to buy it for him, whereas the new tenant dislikes it. He puts cotton wool to block the noise that is coming from the radio. Here again, according to the critics, there's an autobiographical touch, because Mr. Bliney, when he was living at Bodies, Mr. Philip Larkin, when he was living at Bodies, he also got annoyed by the noise of a radio. Then the persona of the poem says, I know his habits. What time he came down, his preference for sauce to gravy, why he kept on plugging at the four-aways, likewise their yearly frame, the Frinton folk who put him up for summer holidays and Christmas at his sister's house in Stoke. So now, after passing some days here in this room, the person of the poem has come to know a lot about Mr. Bliney. He says, I know his habits. What kind of life was being led by Mr. Bliney? At what time would he come back from the factory? What were his preferences in food? And how would he spend the money that he earned in games? And how he would go in the summer holidays to spend his summer with the Frintons, and he would spend the Christmas at his sister's house in Stoke. So he says that I now know that what kind of life did he lead. But if he stood and watched the frigid wind, tousling the clouds, lay on the fusty bed, telling himself that this was home, and grinned and shivered without shaking off the dread that how we live measures our own nature, and at his age, having no more to show than one hired box, should make him pretty sure he warranted no better, I don't know. The usage of this word but is very significant here, because now again the persona of the poem, who is too filled of himself, who thinks that probably he is better than Mr. Bliney, his dislike to the noise of the radio, his preference over having a place for bags and books. And then he says here in these lines that, but if he stood and watched the frigid wind tousling the clouds, this again shows that he is trying to establish his superiority over Mr. Bliney. So he is, in fact, shunning himself from reality, the reality which draws both these characters closer to each other. These both characters, they are facing the dilemma which is faced by every modern man, the dilemma of the futility of life, the meaninglessness of life, of ambitionless life, of lack of creativity, of the helplessness of life. So he's trying to evade all that by the use of this word but. He says that did Mr. Bliney stand by the window and watch the frigid wind tousling the clouds? So here the introduction of nature and the beauty of nature by the persona of the poem tells us that he is probably trying to show that he is more creative than Mr. Bliney. Mr. Bliney, who led a very static kind of a life, who, who was a creature of habit, who, who had certain kind of routines to follow throughout his life. He's, he is now, that is, the persona is now wondering that did Mr. Bliney get a chance to stand by the window to appreciate the beauties of nature? Did he watch the wind tousling the clouds? Here the lines, they become a bit poetic here because Philip Larkin is using a figurative language here because the wind tousling the clouds, that is the wind playing with the clouds, and this introduction of the figurative language, it makes us feel as if the persona of the poem has the potential to appreciate the beauty that is there in nature. So he says, but if he stood and watched the frigid wind tousling the clouds, lay on the fusty bed, telling himself that this was home, and grinned and shivered without shaking off the dread that how we live measures our own nature. Lay on the fusty bed. The usage of fusty bed again tells us the limitations that are there in that room. That did Mr. Bliney, enjoying nature, did he lie on the bed and did he at once grinned and shivered without shaking off the dread, the fear that how we live by our own nature? So did he for once lie on this bed and think that the kind of life that we live is actually what we are, that how we live measures our own nature, the kind of life we aspire to, the kind of dreams that we see about our life is actually the life that we live. So life, it falls short of our expectations. Like the curtains that are lying above the windows, hanging above the windowsill, they show the shortcomings of life. Similarly, here he says that if Mr. Bliney had lived in that room which had limited resources, which showed the kind of life he lived, which showed his financial position, is basically it basically reveals that the goals and the ambitions that we set for our lives are what we achieve in our life. The higher the goals, the higher our standard of life is. The lower our goals and dreams are, this is how we lead our life as Mr. Bline was living. And then he goes on to say that, and at his age, having no more to show, at his age, the age in which he left this world, he had nothing more to aspire to. Then one hired box should make him pretty sure he warranted no better. One hired box is the last box, is the coffin in which you are carried to your final destination. So he says that lying on the bed, thinking about his life, the shortcomings, the limitations, the dreams that he had set for himself, and the goals and the ideals that he had set himself for, they showed, or they, when they were turned into reality, they turned into the reality of the life that he was living. So that is why he deserves just that one hired box. And this kind of life that he was living, it could not guarantee anything better. It could just guarantee him what he had lived, and how now, when he was forced to move from his room, was his final destination, one hired box. But the last three words on which this poem ends, they are very significant. I don't know. The utterance by the persona of the poem here is very significant, because he is forced to draw a parallel between himself and Mr. Bline. He had tried throughout the poem to establish a contrast between himself and Mr. Bline. But by the end of the poem, when he, who is also living in the same room with limited resources, with a limited kind of a financial status, so these three words which he utters at the end of the poem, they bring him to reality. A very bitter truth dawns upon him, that this is what would be his fate. He also does not warrant anything better. How can he, living in the room which was previously occupied by Mr. Bline, could deserve a better fate than Mr. Bline? So through this poem, Philip Larkin has brought home to us the dilemmas faced by the modern man, the dilemmas of isolation, the dilemmas of helplessness of human life, the lack of choice that is faced by the modern man, the dullness and dreariness and the habitual life in which he is entangled. These are some of the recurring themes that Philip Larkin has come across in many of his poems. And in this poem, we notice another important aspect, that from taking a particular example of Mr. Bline, He goes on to make a general statement of modern man. The dilemma of Mr. Bliney, who is a particular example, becomes the dilemma of the general public, the general people, entrapped in the same vicious circle of helplessness, of the futility of life, of the impending death, of limitations that they face in life, and of a fate which is not within their hands. Thank you.